Since childhood, my brother, now known as Daniel, was always different. While other children had imaginary friends or played with their toys, he claimed to see figures that no one else could perceive. At first, everyone dismissed it as a child's vivid imagination, a phase that would soon pass. But as time went on, it became painfully clear that this was not some fleeting childhood fantasy. He not only saw these figures, he spoke with them, engaged with them, as though they were as real as any of us. One of the earliest and most terrifying encounters he had was with a shadowy man who appeared to him frequently. This was no ordinary apparition. There was something deeply wrong about him. The air thickened when he was near, as though the very atmosphere recoiled in his presence. The weight of his darkness seeped into the room, an unseen force pressing down on everything. And yet, despite the unnatural fear he exuded, Daniel was not deterred. Even as a child, he remained undaunted, his curiosity overpowering his fear. He spoke to the man, asked him questions, sought to understand what he was and what he wanted. And then, one day, he finally asked, "Who are you?" The answer changed everything. The man's voice was unlike anything Daniel had ever heard, cold, jagged, and laced with something cruel. "I am a demon," he said. The moment the words left his lips, the room seemed to darken, an oppressive force wrapping around Daniel like invisible chains. His breath became shallow, his chest constricted as if unseen fingers were clawing into his lungs. For the first time, true terror settled in his bones. But Daniel, stubborn and strong-willed even as a child, refused to cower. He straightened his back and forced the fear down. "I don't want to see you anymore," he said, his voice unwavering. The demon did not take kindly to this rejection. His hollow, watching eyes flared with something primal, something malicious. The very air turned toxic, suffocating, heavy with a presence that wanted to consume him. It was no longer merely watching, it was seething. For days afterward, even when the demon did not appear, Daniel could feel him lurking, his presence like a whisper just beyond the veil of sight. He could not shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally when he walked through the house, the air always just a little too cold, a little too still. But he refused to give in to fear. Instead of shrinking away, Daniel changed. Something inside him hardened, his soul shifting in a way that made him colder, darker. He began wandering the streets at night, his silhouette barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. He was no longer just a boy who saw spirits, he was becoming something else. He sought them out, dared them to show themselves, to challenge him. The fear that had once gnawed at him had twisted into something else. Something dangerous. From that moment on, he saw more than ever before. Entities that once lurked in the background now stared at him openly, acknowledging him as something different. Shadows moved where they should not have, grotesque figures slithered in the corners of his vision. But he was not afraid. He had learned to control his fear, to suffocate it before it could take hold. And in doing so, he had gained power. Now, years later, Daniel speaks little of his experiences. There is something unreadable in his gaze, something that hints at knowledge the rest of us could never begin to comprehend. The world around him is not the same as it is for the rest of us. He walks with an air of quiet authority, as though he has seen things that no one else dares to acknowledge. And perhaps, in some twisted way, he has mastered what once sought to master him. Daniel's transformation did not go unnoticed. Our parents worried about his late-night wanderings, his distant stares, the way he seemed to exist in both this world and another. They tried to bring him back to the way he had been, a boy who laughed, played, and showed love, but that boy was gone. He had become something else entirely. Something unreadable, unpredictable. The night walks became routine, and he no longer sought to avoid the things that lurked in the shadows. Instead, he sought them out, challenging them, daring them to show their faces. He was fearless, but there was something darker at play. He had not merely conquered his fear, he had embraced what once haunted him. He became the predator instead of the prey. There were nights when he would return home with scratches on his arms, strange symbols burned into his skin as if seared by invisible flames. When I asked him about them, he only gave a small, knowing smile and turned away. Whatever battles he was fighting, they were beyond my understanding. Then, one night, something changed. He returned home, his eyes wilder than I had ever seen them. He was breathing heavily, his hands shaking. It was the first time in years that I had seen him unsettled. It spoke my name, he whispered. Chills ran down my spine. What do you mean? Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze darting around as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. They never do that. They lurk, they whisper, they taunt, but this one, it spoke my name. It knew me. I had no words. I had long since stopped trying to understand my brother's world, but this felt different. This was not just another encounter. This was personal. The following nights were restless. Daniel was more on edge, more reckless. Whatever had spoken his name had shaken something in him. He pushed further, seeking answers, demanding that the shadows reveal themselves fully. And then, the nightmares started. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of his ragged breathing, his sheets drenched in sweat. Sometimes, I would hear him murmuring in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. A voice layered with something else, something not human. One night, I found him standing in the center of his room, his eyes wide, pupils dilated, staring into nothingness. I called his name, but he did not respond. When I finally reached out to touch his arm, he snapped out of it, gasping as if he had been drowning. It's here, he whispered. And it's waiting. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. Daniel's descent into the unknown only deepened in the days that followed. He barely spoke, his face pale, eyes sunken as if he had not slept in weeks. The nights grew colder, even though the season had not changed. The house felt different, charged with something unseen but undeniable. One evening, I found him in the basement, surrounded by candles. Their flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls, distorting his form into something monstrous. He was muttering words under his breath, words that did not belong to any language I knew. I hesitated before stepping closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Daniel? I called softly. His head snapped up, eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. For a moment, he did not recognize me. Then, something shifted in his expression, and he exhaled sharply. You should not be here, he said, his voice strained. What are you doing? I demanded, stepping closer despite every fiber in my being screaming at me to run. He sighed, rubbing his face. Trying to understand. To prepare. Prepare for what? I asked, though deep down, I already knew the answer. He hesitated before finally saying, It's coming. The room seemed to grow colder at his words. What's coming? I whispered. Daniel closed his eyes. Something that has been watching me for a long time. Something patient. It doesn't just linger in the shadows anymore. It's getting closer. I swallowed the lump in my throat, unsure of what to say. I wanted to call him crazy, to shake him and tell him to wake up from whatever nightmare he had created for himself. But I could not. Because deep down, I could feel it too, the creeping sensation of something just beyond the edge of sight, something waiting. That night, Daniel did not sleep. He stayed in the basement, his candles burning until dawn. And for the first time in my life, I locked my bedroom door. The final night arrived with an unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid of what was about to unfold. Daniel had not spoken all day, his face set in a grim expression. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened, and his hands trembled as he lit the candles once more. I wanted to stop him, to pull him away from whatever force had ensnared him, but it was too late. He was beyond my reach, bound to something unseen, something that had called his name and waited patiently for this moment. As midnight approached, the air thickened, pressing against my chest like unseen hands. A sound, low and guttural, echoed from the basement, a voice, but not Daniel's. I rushed down the stairs, my pulse roaring in my ears. There he stood, surrounded by darkness so absolute that it seemed to devour the candlelight. His eyes were wide, his lips moving in silent prayer, but his body was rigid, as though something else had taken hold. The presence in the room was suffocating, its hunger palpable. I called his name, but he did not respond. The shadows coiled around him, whispering secrets meant for him alone. And then, as if answering an unspoken command, he turned to face me. His eyes were not his own. A smile, wrong, unfamiliar, curved his lips. "It's here," he whispered, his voice layered with something ancient, something not of this world. Panic surged through me. I reached for him, but the air between us shimmered, crackling with unseen energy. The walls trembled, the house groaning as if alive. And then, in the blink of an eye, the candles were snuffed out, plunging us into absolute darkness. A final whisper slithered through the void, "He is ours now." When the lights flickered back to life, Daniel was gone. I searched for him for weeks, months, but he had vanished without a trace. His room remained untouched, frozen in time, as if he might return at any moment. But deep down, I knew the truth. Daniel had been claimed by the thing that had watched him for so long. And though I never saw him again, I could still feel it lurking in the shadows, waiting. Watching. And sometimes, late at night, I hear my name being whispered.